Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live, Black and Korean Solidarity Next Steps. We want to start tonight's session by acknowledging that as a land-grant institution at UCLA, we acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. My name is Rita Suh. I am an adjunct professor at Cal State Long Beach, and I also work at the Culture and Equity Project at UCLA Center X as an educational consultant. But most importantly, I am the proud daughter of South Korean immigrants, and I was born and raised in California. And I am very honored to co-host this session with my friend, Dr. April Parker. And for you audience members, please keep in mind that at the end of this live stream, we have allotted some time for some questions you may have. So please post your questions in Facebook and we'll address them at the end.
Thank you, Rita, and good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. April Parker, and I've been teaching high school English for 15 years. Currently, I'm at Huntington Park High School. Thank you for tuning in, and most importantly, I'd like to thank our guests. I'd like to start by introducing our first guest, Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, who, aside from being a public policy strategist and faith community leader, she is the CEO and co-founder of Skinner Leadership Institute, which coaches and trains leaders in the faith community. Our other panelist is Dr. Kyeyoung Park. She is a professor at UCLA in the Anthropology and Asian American Studies. She's also an author, and one book I'd like to highlight in particular as it relates to our conversation is LA Rising: Korean Relations with Black and Latinos After Civil Unrest. As you can see, mine is dog-eared. I'm going to ask Rita to introduce our third guest. Even though we both met Dr. Rousseau at USC during our doctorate program, Rita and Dr. Rousseau have worked together outside of USC. Most recently, they did a podcast that focused on inequities in education. Rita, will you introduce our dear Dr. Rousseau?
Yes, Dr. Sylvia Rousseau has been a leader in education at every level. I mean, she was a teacher, an administrator, district superintendent, a professor at USC, and now she is retired, but I'm gonna say she has poorly retired because she is just as busy, if not even busier. She remains committed to racial and social equity, especially as it relates to education. So I was honored to be a guest on her podcast that she gets to co-host with her granddaughters. The podcast is called Gen Activist, so please check it out. But anyway, so let's talk about why we're here tonight. We're here to discuss the relationship between Blacks and Koreans with the desire to really walk away with some actionable steps to improve these relations. We have known that there have been problems for a long time between these two communities. But every so often there's something that happens that triggers our rise in our awareness of it. And recently it's been, the Asian hate crimes that have been happening since early last year.
Yes, Rita, you wrote a reflection right after the massacre in Atlanta. And I remember you wanted to be very careful about centering your pain because you felt that your experience didn't measure up to what some Black people have experienced in America in terms of discrimination. And then during that time, I saw social media posts about the attention going toward Asian American hate crimes. And I felt like there was this competition for who was oppressed the most. A colleague of yours shared a term that I love, oppression Olympics. The problem with us engaging in oppression Olympics is that white supremacy benefits when we're distracted and fighting each other, because then we're not focusing on solutions.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why we're here tonight. So let's first start off tonight's discussion by defining the conflict. But again, like I said, we only want to briefly talk about it, and let's talk about how we can move forward and heal. So if you don't mind, Dr. Park, if we can start with you. You have done research on the conflict that exists. Can you please start us off and share your insights as we define what the conflict is?
Right. Yes. Thank you for the invitation. And so-called black orientation indicates a range of intergroup conflict or social conflict. So, for instance, the dispute at the Korean-owned businesses, between merchant and customers, and also African-American boycott of Korean-owned businesses. So it's not just dispute at the stores. Okay, it's well-organized political movement, and also it also includes, unfortunately, 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest, where more than half the financial damage has been done to particularly Korean immigrant merchants, and probably majority riot participant were African Americans and Latinos. Actually, there are more Latinos. And also, most recently, as Rita and also probably April mentioned, that recently in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd and also pandemic induced anti-Asian hate crime and attacks, media portrayed, in many highly publicized cases, they showed most assailant to be African Americans.
Right.
That was not the case, actually. If we look at it in the nation, 75% of the attack has been perpetrated actually by white Americans, including white supremacists, but media almost always showed, they very much sensationalized. So I would say that, the term Black orientation is also kind of problematic. On the one hand, the media reified the media almost like constructed, so everywhere media, and then also people in the community, good or bad, people are using it very overly, using it and abusing it. Whenever you see African Americans and Korean Americans, they call it as Black orientation. Sometimes, in many cases, it could be a random violence, but as if always, anti-Korean, anti-Asian animosity or anti-Black animosity has been attributed. Okay, so I think it is important to understand that for many reasons that we can think about, media constructed and reified Black orientation, as if African Americans, Korean Americans are inherently, they are destined to fight, so I think that's very important how we go about, really demystifying, debunking this kind of myth. But on the other hand, at the same time, I wouldn't say media just manufactured what it didn't exist. It existed. There is a real hostility, on both sides, I would say that. So when we, like, for instance, so-called Black orientation, most highly publicized cases involved in a Korean grocer, Sun Ja-do, and her killing of African-American teenager, Latasha Hollins, and the Korean grocer didn't receive any prison term, That very much angered my interviewees in South LA. But I think in this case, this is a typical case, Black orientation. But African-American, residents and customers, they were outraged at the sentence, okay, that no prison term, but that term has not been delivered or, decided by Koreans, you see. So here we see I'm talking about here really how our criminal justice system is racialized and racist, that, you know. So from my African-American interviewee's perspective, African-American lives, they don't matter, you know. It's being killed, but you know, as if it was nothing. So what I'm saying here is that we shouldn't forget here is that in understanding Black Korean tension, it was not a matter of always African-American or Korean-American responsibility. The players were sometimes, you know, beyond Koreans or African-Americans. Like, for instance, you know, white judge, you know, Colin, who delivered no prison term, you know. So I think that's why we related to racism at the code and, you know, criminal justice system and financial institutions, those things. So definitely, even when we talk about Black Korean tension, people don't understand that systematic institutional racism played a central role, you know. I'm not saying, you know, either Korean merchant or African Americans are innocent, you know. They also played some kind of role, you know, that is unfortunate. Like, for instance, Korean immigrant merchant, they are stereotyped to be rude and racist merchant, you know. So I'm talking about anti-Black racism. At the same time, their African American customers also had anti-Korean, anti-Asian racism and prejudice, you know. Korean merchants complained that they are not respected, they are being abused, you know, and so sometimes including physical attack. So I think that this is why this kind of ethnic tension, you know, always it matters, this kind of white supremacy and structural racism, systematic racism, institutional racism, and at the same time, what I call subaltern racism, you know, minorities, they don't have any white privilege, but they also complicate and they also, you know, yeah, contributes. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park. One of the things and one of the reasons that we were drawn to Dr. William Skinner as it related to what you were saying, Dr. Park, is that she personalized so well on the YouTube show that we watched. She personalized so well the conflict, so on a personal level. Dr. William Skinner, can you share some of the things that just weigh in on what the conflict is, some of the things that you, as you understood through your own experiences?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you, Dr. Park, for that really helpful overview. I view American race relations always in the context of we the people and who is included and who's not included. Neither Koreans or Asian Pacifics for that matter, nor African people, Black Americans were included. So we have to start with the idea that we're all struggling, right, to be fully included in the concept of who is an American worthy of all the assets of a great country. That's the battle. So when people are in a struggle, there's a certain kind of insecurity in that struggle. So we're probably not as, there is division. We need to be clear about that, but we're not as divided as we are disconnected. There's a difference between overt division, right? We're not attacking. African Americans don't think about Koreans every day. They're not at the center of our being. It is white people mostly in our way, or white people who are standing in the doorway, if I could say that, literally, of our progress in terms of the systemic issues, criminal justice, wealth gap, housing, healthcare, those issues that Koreans are not running the agencies. You're not running the financial institutions. So you're not at the center of our concern about how we get our fair share of America. Okay, so that, but the tensions are natural when there's no communication. And the Dr. Park knows this well, and she referred to it as an expert in that area. That, and I was in Watts riot at the time. You know, I was in Watts working. I was at UCLA, okay, where I graduated. I was at 108th Street during the riot, okay, and the analysis that took place, many of the underlying issues of immigrant merchants and local people of color tension, resentment of African Americans over this model minority, that myth that they were compared to, like, you should be like Asians, you should be quiet, you should be, that resentment, that, and also just the difference in cultural way of being, not even understanding one another's culture. Those issues still exist. We may have talked them to death, but we haven't, and that's why I'm glad you're going to get to action. Yeah. Okay, so that's more historic. On the current framework, it was, and how we got to where we are now is the malicious framing of the COVID crisis as attributed to China, and therefore all Asians, that has escalated the violence. Okay, so it may well be that there's just random violence of young Blacks against Asian, or could be part of the disconnect, but the reality is that most of it is not Black people, okay, and she has just affirmed that. But the reality is that what we did not understand, what I've come to understand in meeting Hae-Ping Eam and the people, her team at the Community Empowerment, FACE, LA, is that the problems that we face are more similar than we realize. Yep. That is, whether it's COVID deaths and illnesses, hospitalization, loss of businesses, even down to the criminal justice issues with youth being treated and as adults. The shock for me as a person who's academically oriented and always reading and trying to find out what is the latest in terms of racial equity breakthrough, that was a shock for me as a well-read African-American, that there were so many commonalities. So the problem of being what do you call it, the oppression Olympics, the absurdity of that, and the wasted energy, the wasted intellect, the wasted problem solving on that, when we have so many similarities. I think that's where we have to land. We have to understand, number one, problems do exist because we don't know each other that well. We don't know each other's culture, each other's history. There is a sense that most of the current energy is around anti-Asian violence, right? And that African Americans like myself reached out to Asian leaders like Hae-Ping Eam and said, how can we help? But that there's no reciprocity. There's no similar concern about, okay, how can we be helpful to you? So we have a long way to go, and that's why I hope we will get soon into where do we go on actions? Because I have some ideas, but we got some work to do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Williams Skinner. Dr. Rousseau, as we segue to solutions, I'm thinking of your wisdom. How
do I have some of that?
Yeah, a whole bunch.
Sure.
Why is it important to find solutions? And Dr. Williams Skinner kind of hinted at this with what she just shared. But why is it important? It's an obvious question, but let's say it just to say it.
Yeah, I'd like to share my screen for a second.
Okay.
Just one little thing. So just this, I want to show this. This was put together by a group of Latinos, Hispanics about the construct of race and the construction of whiteness in America. And even though it's geared toward the Spaniards coming into America, I
Dr.
think
Russo, it's not sharing yet.
Oh, it's not?
Is there a
Oh,
final click, maybe?
yeah, let me see. It should be sharing though.
Rita, do you see it?
Maybe unshare and then share it again.
Yeah. Uh, okay, let me go out of this. Wow. Your screen sharing, it says. You share. Oh, I'm not going to waste our time on that. Okay. I can't get out of it now.
Stop
So
sharing. Stop sharing. The orange button, stop sharing.
stop sharing.
Mhm.
But it's a construct and I won't waste a lot of time. And it's in the form of a pyramid. And what's key about that, at the very bottom of the pyramid are Blacks. And this is how the Americas were constructed as Europeans came. And then up the ladder is maybe mulattoes. And up the ladder are indigenous people. And up the ladder further are this and that. But at the very top is, at the very apex, is white, not only Spaniards, born in Europe. And then slight under them are white, but not born. I show that to say that we're all living in a construct and we're all influenced by that construct. What I like about that when I examined that pyramid was that it made me think of gradations of color determining the definition of whiteness. And it made me think of coloreds in South Africa, where the coloreds, I refer to them as the in-betweeners. So that based on color of skin, you get a little more privilege, but it's all based in anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism. But as you gain a little more melanin, you gain a little more privilege. You never belong. And that's something to remember about Asian Americans, Korea. You never belong, but you get a few privileges. And the design is to give you just enough privilege to make you think you belong and to pit you against those who are at the bottom. And I think unless we grapple with that, we won't find solutions.
Exactly.
One other thing that grips me is a quote that I love. Everybody who knows me gets tired of me saying it, by John Henry Clark.
Never tired.
History isn't everything, but it's a start. It's the clock that tells us the cultural time of day. And it is the chart that helps us find our places on the map of human geography. I think that that's such an important piece in this as we all engage in our struggles, is that we are struggling to find our place on the map of human geography. But in the midst of our struggle, someone else who has the power and the capital is trying to tell us where we belong on the map of human geography. And all history is the struggle. When we talk about what we call the Olympics, the
Oppression
Olympics, it's all of us struggling to try to assert for ourselves where we belong on the map of human geography. But the degree to which we are in control of this construct pits us against each other. So for that reason, I'm jumping from that to what I think are solutions. And I think it's something about empathy. Each of us thinks the other struggle is greatest. I, from the perspective of an African American, say that pyramid is all based at the bottom on anti-Black racism. But the point being, in this America, we are struggling against a common oppressor who pits us against each other as we're struggling to find our places on the map of human geography. My last point on this, I, as an educator, spent all my life in it. I even went to school and then I began teaching and administrating. I think that education has a huge role in this. The segregation, the struggle of Asian Americans coming to America, what jobs they could have. There's been schools, everyone has had to struggle to get in this place called school. And schools just keep resisting. You can get in, but you're not really in. We'll physically integrate you, but we will not be integrated in terms of curriculum and the knowledge of history and your capital that you bring. You will never belong. And I think that that's key issue. My point is, we keep talking about integration between Black people with white people, brown people with white people, Asian Americans with white people. We don't deal with integration among ourselves that doesn't necessarily include white people, so that we can define our identities without it always having to be juxtaposed to whiteness.
That's true.
And so education that leads into solutions, we've done a terrible job of history. Everybody didn't come to America on the same basis. Some came with more money, more wealth, more welcoming, but it's always based in this anti-Black structure that gradations above it give you a little more privilege, but you never really belong.
That's so true.
Dr. Rousseau, stay on that for a minute. What can, you know, I'm a high school English teacher. What else can educators do to?
First of all, we can start telling the truth about our history.
Amen.
And as long as people can hide from that, they don't have to really deal with who we are. The problem is our humanity. And I think we have to claim our humanity on our own, and we have to negotiate relationships that we have with other racial groups on our own without white people being involved. And so, but our history tells us what the root of some of this is. And it prevents us from having empathy for one another.
Sure.
And my husband was a pastor, and he was part of a group. It was a group of Christian ministers, Korean pastors, and Black pastors. And my late husband was a member of that. And there was this effort, but there's a quote from one of those where one of the women said, dialogue is not enough. And so how do we, I don't think I even want to talk about allyship. I want to call our Asian brothers and sisters to become co-disruptors with us.
That's one of the words said a lot in the podcast, and it's true. Co-disruptors and co-agitators.
Co-agitators, yes.
Thank you. And Dr. William Skinner, I also know you work in the faith community. You also do, like I said, a lot of work in the public sector. What are some examples that you have seen where people have started to work together?
Yeah, I thank you, Dr. Rousseau. I think I just want to build on a point that she made about self-awareness and self-knowledge. And I want to put that in the context of faith, and that is the image of God, the imago Dei, the concept that every person is created in this divine, this awe-filled and awe-inspiring divine image, and deserve to be treated with the utmost dignity in all things. If we can just capture that for a moment, then it gets us out of the tribalism and the boxes category boxes. Even as we talk about race, we talk as though we're not even children of the same creator, okay, who have different social locations or social and cultural frames of reference. The frames of reference doesn't make us less human on the planet together.
Yes.
So I think we have to, I think the word humanity really helps, but it's also being self-aware, self-conscious, and also claiming the agency of my personhood, that I have value. Whether I have a PhD or no D, I have value. And then I should therefore value every other person on the planet,
Yes.
including white people. Now, I'm
Yes.
going to say this. I'm fighting a system. I'm not fighting because I have as many white allies as I have Black and brown and Asian allies. So I'm fighting a system. And I think that, but I can't fight, as evil as that system is, I cannot fight it unless I feel I have a right to be where I need to be. So no one has to give me privilege or right or an access. No one can invite me to the human race. So we have to start with some education of our children and ourselves, that, as my mother said, when you walk into a place, the first person in my family to go to college, and she's giving me instructions as I'm leaving home, a mother who who was a domestic. When you walk in like you have a right to be there.
Yes.
And no one will ever know the difference. That has taken me all over the world, just that concept that I don't have to be invited in. I have a right to be there because I'm a taxpayer, a citizen, but I'm also a person. So I think we have to start there. Now, the second is relationships. There's nothing more powerful than relationships. Relationships exceed titles, positions. Our positions change, our titles change. I've had many different jobs. I've come in and out of jobs. So if the only value that I have is the position that I hold, no, it is the relationship. So I have connections with people that have nothing to do with where they went to school or how many letters behind their name. The fact that we have this bond that no matter what, we're in this together. I think it's so that you can't intellectualize that. You have to enter into life together. You have to think about, how do you do life together? And that's what Haypeen and I have decided. For example, we were doing the video together in Washington, D.C. I knew she probably was going to get into a hotel. I have a big house. I live near Washington, near the Capitol, 3 miles from the Capitol. I invited her into my home. I'm a very private person. I don't just do that. But I realized that I couldn't think about engaging a new relationship with an Asian woman that I didn't know, because otherwise she'd just be a project. And when the filming is over, I'm going to go about my way and her. Now we have a different kind of bond. I know a little bit more about her family, her background, her struggle, her hopes and dreams, and she has more about mine. So I think the second thing we have to think about this is building a sense of connection that takes us out of one another as categories. What do I mean? I mean that there's my life is busy. All of our lives are busy. So Haypeen invited me to a regular Asian prayer breakfast. They probably didn't normally have Black people at their prayer breakfast, but she invited me. Okay. So that's inviting me into her community. That was very special. I'm a voting rights advocate. So I'm on the Capitol steps back in April with Black women, very powerful Black women in Washington, and Black members of Congress, women members of Congress. So I invited her to speak about the Asian perspective, the language difficulty, the issues of the disabled, and the problems that these voter restrictions will have for elder Asian people. Okay, that was something that expanded the thinking of one of the Black women there. She was the only Asian there. We have to invite one another into our space. Otherwise, we're category boxes. to one another. The question is, are we prepared to do that? Otherwise, I think Dr. Park is right that it's not as much of a tension as it is an exaggeration. No, it's tension until we make it relationships.
Thank you. Dr. Park, do you, if you can add, in your work, in your field, if you have seen also and any specific examples you can share?
Yeah, I mean, right after the 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest, I mean, already, you know, a long time ago, but I witnessed when I went to South LA that Korean immigrant merchants, they started to hire African Americans, you know. Nobody told them to do anything. Actually, before the civil unrest, African American community leaders and activists, they demanded, but Korean immigrant merchants, they had all kinds of excuses. It's a mom and pop store, you know, it's not a good pay. African Americans are not interested in working for them, but so majority employees became African Americans, you know. I mean, right now in South LA, demographics has changed and it has become predominantly Latino community. So therefore, even ethnic makeup of Korean immigrant merchant employees became also predominantly Latinos. But I think that's a big change. And also, Korean immigrant merchant that I interviewed, they appreciated the fact that the African-American customers, somehow they felt so sorry for what happened to Korean immigrant merchant, you know, and they apologized, and Korean merchant, they deeply appreciate it. And also they realized that they will have to treat these customers better, whatever ways, you know. So they are trying, despite whatever, you know, language barrier and cultural barriers, but it's not difficult to figure out how you are treated, you know. So I think Korean merchants try to treat their customers with more respect. And I would say that, I mean, that's the kind of examples that I saw in South LA. And I would say that broadly, I mean, the religion and Christianity already, Dr. Williams already commented on faith and having hymns, you know. So, I mean, I have known that Korean American and African American, mostly Christian, right? Christian leaders, they've been actually working together for a long time. I would say that for many decades. So I'm not going to comment on religion, but I think I want to also mention the area of art and culture. As you know, for young, you know, Korean Americans and Asian Americans, really hip hop culture is the predominant one. And then also increasingly African Americans embrace of K-pop. So I see mutual influence, you know, I mean, also K-pop artists and singers, they were inspired by African American music, dance, and yeah. So I think even in my research in South LA, my interviewees, they told me that because they are curious about Korean food, they would like to try Korean food, you know. So I think this interest in each other's culture, I think that can be a good stepping stone, I would say that. I mean, I don't mean just being able to enjoy others' culture will solve all the problems, but that seems to be a very easy way for ordinary people, you know, get to know and be interested in anything else about others' culture, you know, other than even food. So I mentioned it, but I think most importantly, I want to point out the area of politics. I would say that after really police killing of George Floyd, you know, and then their war, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders for Black Lives Matter. So I think it became very serious, and Korean Americans realized that it's okay to talk about racism, you know. So, and particularly they didn't realize that how much anti-Black racism is so prevalent, has been perpetuated, you know. And then also, I think as maybe some of you mentioned, some African-American politicians, they joined Koreatown rally condemning anti-Asian hate crime and attacks, you know. So not many, but increasing, I mean, you know, some numbers. So I think these are in a way, I mean, I'm not saying everybody, all the Korean Americans are for, but you know, some number of them, increasingly, particularly young Korean Americans, they are very serious and they try to fight. Really, you know, against this systematic racism, white supremacy, as well as anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism, because these are all, in a way, you know, intertwined. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
Build
Park.
on what Dr. Parks just said so powerfully about politics. Right now, last night, we saw in Virginia a race that was about race.
Absolutely.
You have a new Southern strategy in critical race theory. This is as much about forced busing, Willie Horton, you know, all of the language that triggers somebody's taking something from you. That's what it was about. How do you ban something that doesn't even, is not even taught in school? Except it was about race. I mean, that's the absurdity of it. I'm disappointed at white women who allowed themselves to get caught in that. 57% voted for a lie. Not that the Democratic candidate was perfect. There's no perfect candidates, okay? As I say to people, Jesus and Moses aren't running, neither's Mary, okay? So we're really talking about imperfect. But so that's what so if you think about now, in 360 days, you have a midterm election. Here is another opportunity for Black and Asians to begin to think about what is the self-interest of Asians in school board races. You have two Asians who were elected as mayors, Cincinnati and Boston, of all places. Boston, where the center of forced busing controversy years ago. So we have an opportunity, and of course the new mayor of New York City and the Pittsburgh Black Americans. Okay, so here's some opportunities before us. We don't have to talk about, I think the construct that Dr. Rousseau raised of anti-Black racism is real. And Asians need to learn about our history, and we need to learn about your history. I think if there's some actions, we can have table talk, we'd have more conversations like this. We should be doing more videos. We should be doing the kind of teaching on Instagram, Facebook Live, and others that we're doing now that'll reach a younger audience. But we have a lot of opportunities. What are the races that are up? There are 34 Senate races up. There are some places where the Asian community may be small, but it's very powerful. And if connected to the Black population vote, could make a significant difference. Those are the conversations that could matter about the systemic issues that we just talked about, the housing issues, the fact of healthcare and hospital issues and the criminal justice issue. I'm just saying that we have an opportunity to stop talking and start walking.
I'd agree.
I was thought about when Dr. William Skinner, when you talked about our faith, our common faith, and what I wanted to talk about, I had not remembered this. When my husband came to California to pastor, there was a Korean church worshiping in the education building of where our services were. And on holidays, particularly Christmas, we would come together, and the Korean church would come in their regalia, their beautiful dresses, And they would, we would have these cantatas in English and Korean. And there is a spirit, Dr. William Skinner, that moved among us. There were only two words we recognized in each other, amen and hallelujah. And so at various points, the whole congregation was saying amen and hallelujah. But that's a spiritual bond that my husband maintained with the pastor of that church for many years. And children grew up together in our summer programs together, Korean and Black children. So I think a point we have to make here, the second part of the last part of John Henry Clark's quote is not just find our places on the map of human geography, but he said, but more importantly, it helps us find out who we must become. And I think that that's the opportunity we have. I was on a podcast with my granddaughter the other day, and there's this young woman who's gone back to the South to claim land in and to live on the land. And she said she and her fiance were moving through places in middle Georgia, ironically, where my mother had been from. And she said, as she walked through them, this is why history, we have to deal with history.
Yeah.
Because as she walked to various places, her mind kept wondering, well, what was it like in this space for my ancestors? And she said, and there's a fear that arose in her that when she would pass the flags, what am I saying? Confederate flags, and the trucks would pass. She said there was a kind of fear that came up in her, like, oh, should I be here? And so it struck me what you said, Dr. William Skinner, when she said something else rose up in her and said, I belong here. And so part of it is defining our own spaces where we can work together independently, but for the same causes of not justice for ourselves, but justice that it finds its place in all of us in defining our humanity. Justice and equality, I mean, those are such abstract terms, but we can find places and define places where we act that out in the religious community, in the political community, in education, for heaven's sake, literally for God's sake, where segregation has kept people apart. We don't know each other. We don't trust each other. And I think there's something in our humanity that when we know each other, we really honor our own humanity that we see in each other, that we don't have to abandon our own identities because we embrace or invite in someone who's different from us. So those fears many times paralyze us on both sides.
Yeah, I think the fear of loss,
yes,
of significance, and I'll tell you this, Jesus said, you'll know the truth and it'll set you free. So let me just confess this, that when I first met Haiping on Zoom, we were in several meetings together of other mostly white, but diverse clergy leaders. Okay, maybe there were a few Asians and maybe a few African-Americans, maybe one or two Hispanics, Latinx, but they're mostly white. I mean, this is a fairly large gathering, maybe 60 or so on Zoom. And we were on several times together on other issues of COVID in general. On that particular day, I didn't know that, but she was presenting the PowerPoint on how COVID has impacted the Asian community. Now, I'll be honest with you, okay? I mean, I can sound very loving, but I was annoyed. Like, how these same white people haven't given us the time of day. They have ignored everything that has to do with Black equity advancement. And now y'all gonna have a whole hour on Asian advancement. Well, I could just go do something else, okay? And then I was just wrestling within myself. And I had to honestly, I mean, I had to sit myself down without moving and have a talk to myself. Say, self, your behavior, your attitude sucks. You need to grow up. They have a right to have a conversation just like you. And so then I settled down and I started listening. And I learned more than I ever understood how connected we were. So I think we still have to acknowledge there's this sense that if Asians advance, we lose. And if African Americans advance, Asians lose. That's absurd. There's enough on the planet, literally, for everybody. And then we have to get to that space where we are not competing, but we are collaborating. And so I think if we could talk about, as Dr. Park suggested, more ways that we can collaborate. For example, we could collaborate. Think about the annual conferences that we already have, right? Okay, so I hosted before COVID a 3,000 person prayer breakfast in Washington, D.C. I've been doing that for the last 30 years. I host other meetings even now. You all do that. You all do that right now.
Right.
Where are the natural spaces where you could add Dr. Park or Dr. Rousseau, so that voice, that perspective, that history, that point of view is heard? I think that's so easy for us to do. It's just a matter, we already control an agenda, right? So we can do that. So I think we need to think about what are the things that we don't have to add new activity. Think about including one another in the things we are already doing that matter to us in our organizations.
If I can add one thing that I started to do with my family, and they're watching now, so thank you. But one of the things that I started to do was just even having the conversations and bringing to light an awareness that most of our lens and our view of how we view ourselves and the way we see others is still a white supremacist view. I mean, the idea that anti-Blackness is still, even within our Korean community, first thing that Asian moms say when we go out is, you better put on sunscreen because you can't get dark, you can't get tan. We have deep colorism issues within our own community. But where do those viewpoints come from? Questioning that and understanding that we are not only oppressed by that, but we continue to be the oppressors of that because we don't even understand where those views come from. So yeah, within our own small groups of family and friends, having the conversations is really important. My mom always says, because my mom is an immigrant, she said when she came here from Korea, the LA riots for her was such a turning point because she never realized anyone else was suffering. Her view was, I'm here and I'm trying to survive and I'm trying to get food on the table for my 4 children. She didn't realize that anyone else was suffering. She didn't think about having to adopt American cultures and values and learn the history. She just didn't think about that. She was in survival mode. Then the LA riots happened and she realized, oh, there are other people suffering, and I have to understand what that feels like. So yeah, I didn't know she felt that way until earlier last month. I mean, really, we haven't had those conversations. We really just didn't. And it's also, I think Dr. Park can attest to this, in the Korean community, we just don't talk about things like that. We don't talk about emotions. We don't talk about things that hurt us or question things. Questioning too, very culturally, Koreans, I'm never allowed to question anything. You just do it. And even if I hated it, I was not allowed to question it. So that's also very cultural.
But we question everything.
I love that.
I think what you described, Dr. William Skinner, is zero-sum game. So we've all been, we're all trapped by this thing of a concept of insufficiency, not enough. And much of what drove the uprisings and the disputes and conflicts between Blacks and Koreans in the 90s particularly was this zero-sum game that you have and I don't have. And it visibly was zero-sum game because Blacks in those communities knew that they'd never been able to get loans or to own a business, and economically they were being shut down. And here comes somebody else from somewhere else. This is just the realness of it. Here, my people, in many Black people's mind, went through Jim Crow, through slavery. They worked hard and they never could get enough money to own a business. And here comes someone from another country who owns a business and who treats us in a way that's disrespectful. So that's why knowledge of history is so important. So as your mom said, she didn't know this history of Black people in America, nor did Black people in Central, I don't use South Central, in South LA, know the history and what maybe had driven Koreans here. And so this big thing about critical race theory is really only about one thing.
Right.
Don't tell the truth about history. That's what it's all about. They don't even know what critical race theory means. They have no idea. They just mean that if you start telling the truth about the history of this nation, you're going to disturb our children. With never remembering the suffering of the people who lived through it. And it's this identity that the world belongs, this construct of whiteness. And I agree with you, Dr. Skinner. It's not white people, but this construct.
Yes.
That the world is all about them. Because if you didn't interpret that the world is all about us, you would want children to know this history. And you wouldn't feel you have to own it. You would just say it's man's humanity against man. And we don't want our children to emulate it. But it's this owning of it as if you are above reproach, etc., that is driving this whole movement. And so I'm inviting our Korean friends to acknowledge that you on that pyramid are often used as a means to just enough privilege, call you the model minority, but the real game is to use you as a buffer so they don't have to deal with Black people. And if we could get that understanding, I think we would see the commonness in our struggle.
Absolutely. Yeah,
But
I
the
agree with
sickness of the model minority myth is that then you don't have to deal with the real struggles that Asian people have. If you're a model minority, you don't have a housing loan problem. You don't have a rental problem. You don't have a problem with criminal justice. Oh, the fact that you're not the top CEO or the major management level person at any major Fortune 500, oh, we don't even have to deal with that. So it hurts Asians to even, to keep up that model minority myth. I don't think you are, but I'm saying we have to expose it, that that's not us. I think that what you're saying about, it's really about truth. This is about truth, because in looking at the Brookings Institute study on critical race theory, and there are many persons studying, I've just begun studying myself, so I would understand it. There are 14 states now that have banned critical race theory that's not even being taught. This is how absurd this so race issue is. 20 more that state legislatures are considering it. Now that means that the Japanese internment could not be talked about.
Right.
Forget about the Watts riot and whatever happened to merchants. We're talking about, you couldn't talk about the Civil War. you can't talk about anything that's happened. Eventually, you wouldn't be able to talk about slavery. So this is like an eraser of history. So if there's no pain, then there's no way to get redress. Okay,
Yes.
if you don't have a problem. So I think it's in all of our interests to begin to hold forums and talk about what is the impact of this lie. That's what it is. It's not about critical race theory. It's about white minority rule. See, in the 2000 census was the most chilling.
Yes.
It should have been the most chilling for all of us. Because when I read the results of it, it said that by 2060, that was 2000, that's 60 years later. Okay, we're at, we're halfway there. We're at 2021, 22 now. Okay, so it could be, but now they've reduced it down to like 2045. So it's like in 20 years, there will be no majority race.
Yeah.
Okay, that notion struck fear.
Yeah.
Fear. That was the attack on Obama. That was ferocious. The idea that you could have a Black president. That was the rise again of the Klan that had diminished somewhat. Okay. The rise of the white militia. And then you have a president that co-signs that. Okay. Then you have the now COVID and the anti-Asian. So all of this is playing into the idea that today, 57% of America is white. In 2020, 1965 was 85%. So you've gone from 85%, right, to now 57%. Now, fast forward another 20 years, be no majority race. We haven't even begun to wrap our minds around what happens and what will happen when people feel that they have to commit violence. And that's why right now, I've heard on television recently people saying, well, there may have to be some violence to maybe get our way. Today, someone said, if you keep up forcing masks on children and vaccinations on children, we may have to burn some schools down. I'm saying there is a cycle of oppression that's followed by usually resistance of the group that's oppressed, followed by advancement. But that advancement is usually followed again by more oppression. We're back in that oppression state. So the question is, what should be the level of our nonviolent resistance? We've got to begin. I mean, it's great to build relationships. It's great to eat food together. We better start thinking strategically about what levels. And this, I'm not attacking. I have no one listening saying I'm not anti-white. I'm saying I'm talking about the people who are now feeling the brunt of anti-Black racism. And it's aimed at people of color, that include Asian. We better start thinking strategically about how do we focus our energy so that we are protected, okay? And I'm not talking about guns and butter. I'm talking about how do we live in a nation where, like Oklahoma and the Black Wall Street, Black people were doing nothing but being citizens in 1920. They took a plot of land that happened to have it, they found oil on, not bothering anybody. And white resentment is what we're dealing with right now. White resentment usually, historically, has exploded into violence. Okay, so the question is now I'm gonna go a leap forward and say, okay, then how do we bring, I know Dr. Rousseau probably don't want to hear this, but how do we bring white people into the conversation? Because if you're part of the problem, you better be part of the solution.
I think we have to be strategic about how we bring them in.
Okay.
And there is, and I think that was true in the civil rights movement. It was part of the division, the civil rights movement, that at some point some of the Black leaders said, we appreciate your allyship, we want, etc. But some of these conversations have to be among us. I think people of color in this nation need to recognize that we have a common foe. We have a common foe. I don't care how light your skin is or how dark your skin is. We have a common foe, and we have to do intentional coalition building.
No question
And
about
that can occur politically, it can occur in churches, it can occur in neighborhoods, but we can't fiddle around with it. I absolutely agree with you. We are in great peril right now. And when something is dying, this is a funny little thing. My dad had a great idea about killing a turkey for Christmas, for Thanksgiving. We were going to have a fresh turkey. And so my brothers were supposed to hold the turkey while he chopped the turkey's head. Well, my brother got scared just as the axe was coming down, so only hit part of the turkey. So the turkey got up with his neck like this, running up and down the street, da 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 da. And my point is that when something is dying, it is the most frantic. It is its resistance is the strongest. And what you described with that census and what it said to people, people see that the power that they once held is threatened. And so they're making loud noises and doing the absurd. It's almost humorous, except it's so tragic, how absurd the actions are. And that's what we're seeing in this time. So I think this is time to get busy about intentional coalition building in schools, in churches, in neighborhoods, politically, wherever.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah. Rita, do we have any questions? I know that our time is almost spent.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to.
We have one question. When trauma and hurt are so real, how do you start to show empathy for those who you feel are oppressing you?
I think empathy is what Dr. Rousseau talks about. I think that comes from my humanity. I hope I never lose the capacity to see another person as human. I can hate everything they do. I can hate their behavior. I can hate their viewpoint because their viewpoint may be hurting me or hurting the people I care about or my race. But I hope I never, I cannot ever let if I put it this way, my oppressor become my teacher.
Right.
I cannot become like that which I hate. And I hate the behavior, but I can still see the humanity in the person. Now, it is not easy. I must say that. So I don't want anybody to think that, I just woke up this morning crazy. Okay. This is something you have to continue to work on. It comes through me from the love of God that was showered on me when I didn't deserve it. Okay. So I try to always, not demonize the other person.
Yes.
If anything, I'm going to demonize the behavior, patterns, and systems.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think if I understood correctly, I think when we talked about empathy, I don't think we meant empathy for the people with power, there could be another matter, how to love who doesn't love you, like racist, right? I mean, it becomes a racist love. But I think when we were talking about empathy as most important strategy in this age was empathy really among minorities, I would say that particularly Korean Americans, African Americans, and Asian Americans and African Americans, so instead of being pit against each other, I think I always say that like for Korean Americans and African Americans, they will have to, there is no other choice, but to develop empathy because like even for instance, even about the anti-Asian hate crime, what would be the best way? I mean, if we use law and order, how many people we prison them, I mean, it's not going to solve the problem. So I think that is why we need alternative way than carceral response. You see, just arresting them, capture them, it doesn't solve the problem, you see, because the problem is very complex. So, and it looks like we don't have any other choice, otherwise it'll be self-destructive. So when we talked about, there has been a lot of talk about empathy. I think we are talking about empathy, particularly among the people who do not have any power or resource, like minorities, and that is the way. Then instead of being pit against each other, continue to be divided and fighting over whatever limited amount of pie, we have to ask for a bigger pie, in different ways. So I just want to make correction here. Yeah.
Well, maybe the word and I should be using, listening to you, Dr. Park, is love. I can love my enemy.
I just wrote that word.
Yes.
I can love my enemy and still hate what my enemy does, because that's my humanity. I choose to do that. I don't have to do that. I think one of the things that Dr. Rousseau suggested earlier when she talked about the construct, which I think is very powerful, and you referenced South Africa, where I did spend some time. There was always a fear by the white South Africans that when Blacks and coloreds and Indians came into power, that they would be as vicious and mean and evil and hateful and whatever. And I think there's some of that here in our country as well. The reality is that it never happened. It didn't happen in the South. It doesn't happen. And part of it is because the sickness of racism is sometimes people of color hate themselves and love the people who hate them.
Absolutely.
Okay? That's the psychic damage. That's the inferiority complex. That is the sense that I'm not worthy because I'm not white. That's sick. That's a cancer. Okay. So, but there is a fear that whites had that if people of color became the mayors and the governors and the president and the heads of the corporations and whatever, they would mistreat white people. It some kind of way people of color have, I don't know if we have, now I'm going to go back to the word empathy. Okay. We have ability. We have an ability to love the unlovable. I think it's part of our own, the victim mentality. We have that capacity. Yeah. And I hope we don't lose that. I don't want to lose it. And this may sound strange. So I just am livid every time I read an article, see a TV program, I'm livid. But there's a kind of empathy I have for people who've lost their humanity in that way. And I have an empathy. I will resist them with all I have, but I have empathy for their loss of humanity. And I have empathy when I go back to schools for the people who follow them, who've been so miseducated, have no idea what critical thinking, forget critical race theory. They have no idea what critical thinking is. And they just follow like sheep over the cliff. I have some empathy for them. That does not mean that I'm not livid when I see the things they do. And it does not mean that I will not resist them. But I do have empathy for their loss of humanity. Mm-hmm. Amen.
I want to add something to the point that you two are making. Another reason that the myth of retaliation can be debunked is I don't think the goal is even to return or reciprocate. The goal is just get off my neck so I can move forward. I'm not even trying to retaliate, get revenge, do anything reciprocal to what was done to me. I just want you to get out of my way so that I can live freely and so that I can be all that I can be. I think that's another reason that the idea of retaliation isn't in us.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what kind of messages, was it was McLuhan said many years ago, the medium is the message. So
Yeah.
messaging helps and is critical. So the question I guess I have for myself is, how do we begin to message more effectively the kind of humanity, the kind of aspirations we have for our people, the kind of togetherness we'd like to see and unity we'd like to see? I think that's the question I have. How do you think we might achieve better messaging?
You know, I have a lot of grandchildren and children, and there's some phenomenal things that these young people are doing on social media. I mean, some of it's madness and some of it's just ridiculous, but there's some great thinking and alliance building occurring among young people on social media. We might, you know, I don't know. I get my news from my granddaughter, but I think we could learn some things from the way that young people are approaching it. But they're out there on their own doing it. They don't have the support of older people, I think, more seasoned people, in helping them construct that in ways that it has more structure and impact. But that's one thing that comes to my mind immediately, because I used to tell my granddaughter, well, these kids don't know and they're just spouting off. And she starts showing me some texts and some podcasts, etc. These young people, among all these people of color, are building some coalitions, but I don't think they have directions how to act on them.
Well, I think that's our responsibility. I mean,
Yes.
about 15 years ago, began a master series for distinguished leaders of the millennial leaders, to bring them to over a 6-month period, 2 days a month. They came from business, they came from entertainment or whatever, average age 30, and connected with them with mentors who were, you know, my generation. And we're in our 14th year. We have learned so much from them. We talk about how you build character and integrity and work on history. Spend a lot of time on exchanging ideas about how we fight racism differently. How do they engage in their social context? I think that the intergenerational connection for all of us needs to be strengthened. And too many people in my generation have just disconnected, I think, from young people. We can learn a lot from them. It's not just that we have all the wisdom. They have amazing ways of thinking that we will never know. And I think we can learn from one another. We really can. I mean, they even got me on Instagram now. I'm like, really?
Oh, I'm doing Instagram. I'm doing podcasts. I'm doing all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and that's the thought behind Dr. Rousseau's podcast, The Gen Activist, is to have the conversation.
Love it.
It's phenomenal.
I would love to invite you, both of you, because it's intergenerational. I'm the grandmother, and my granddaughter, I used to text my grandchildren all these messages every morning. You better pay attention to this. Are you listening? You need to, you know, all of this about consciousness of what's happening. And she would share them with her friends, and they would say, I want a grandmother like that. And so that's how she got the idea. Well, we're going to do these podcasts, and boy, do I see some people on here that I'd love to invite to that podcast. Please.
Absolutely. Just sorry, April, I know you're going to close just a funny thing. One of my students said that he's happy that all this anti-CRT conversation is happening. He said even his friends who claim they don't see color, or that Black people and Asians are always claiming to be the victims and it's because they don't work hard, you know, this idea of meritocracy, whatever. He said, but all this conversation of all these politicians and adults made them look into it. He said, I didn't even know what CRT was, but now they have us curious, which I thought was so funny, because I don't even know if they realize how much it backfired on the younger generation.
Absolutely.
Streisand.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm so glad that I, on behalf of Rita and I do want to thank Doctors Rousseau and William Skinner and Park for lending your expertise and your wisdom to this topic. And the reason we wanted you here is because of what you just said. We need to be including in these spaces intergenerational lenses to look at these situations. And I'm so glad that you all were here to help us. We were inspired by the YouTube show that Dr. William Skinner was on, and my pastor, Bishop Omer, Dr. Rousseau, our pastor, was on, and some other leaders in the community. And at the end of it, they said, and I think it was Dr. William Skinner said, now what are you going to do? And so
that sounds like something I would say.
Yeah.
That's
And
right.
so Rita and I said, okay, well, we were both watching it, and we said, let's do something. Rita and I share, we became friends at USC, and we've been hanging tough ever since. And so we said, let's do something. And so I said, okay, well, we got to invite Dr. William Skinner because she's the one who started all of that. So
But I hope somebody listening to this conversation, because I've learned so much from Dr. Park and Dr. Rousseau tonight,
too.
are provoked to gather themselves with their, their buddies and friends across these lines of Asian and Korean culture.
I'm sure it's going to light a fire. I'm sure it's going to light a fire. And again, I do want to mention Dr. Park's book,
Yes.
LA Rising. It's really great. I learned so much. I live on 108th between Western and Van Ness, and I was very much a part of the turmoil that was experienced from the Los Angeles Rebellion. And I was impacted and hurt by what happened to Latasha Harling. So reading this, though, I even learned more. And you know how it is when you look at data. It's so illuminating.
Yes.
So I want to encourage our viewers to read this book and like we said, to let the spark be lit to do something, to reach out to your brothers and sisters and do something. It doesn't have to be a live Facebook show. It can be just going to one another's faith temples or just getting to know each other on a deeper level and doing something to share that. I also want to thank all of you who tuned in and for joining us in this venture, this conversation. And I also want to thank Dr. Orange and her Cultural and Equity Project at UCLA Center X for producing this Facebook Live session. And again, I want to challenge those of you to take individual responsibility for promoting the healing between our communities. And now we pass that challenge on to you.
Yes.
We look forward to seeing where you take this.
Yeah.
May I say, before we close this, that I couldn't be more pleased and more proud of two young women who I had the opportunity to share life with and ideas with, and who have inspired me to keep in the struggle. So I want to thank the two of you for just taking the initiative to do things, to make things happen. And I'm extremely proud of that.
Well, you made us promise.
That's true. We had no choice, but that means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Some of you may be getting invitations from me.
I will.
Parker, I haven't seen you on my